Susan Cooper, The Dark is Rising, Part 3, The Testing, The Coming of the Cold. The next day, the snow still fell all day, and the next day, too. "I do wish it would stop," said Mary, unhappily gazing at the blind white windows. "It's horrible, the way it just goes on and on. I hate it." "Don't be stupid," said James. "It's just a very long storm. No need to get hysterical." "This is different. It's creepy." "Rubbish. It's just a bit of snow." "Nobody's ever seen so much snow before. Look how high it is. You couldn't get out the back door if we hadn't been clearing it since it started to fall. We're going to be buried, that's what. It's pushing at us. It's even broken a window in the kitchen. Did you know that?" Will said sharply. "What?" "The little window at the back near the stove. Gwenny came down this morning and the kitchen was cold as ice, with snow and bits of glass all over that counter. The snow had pushed the window in, the weight of it." James sighed loudly. "Weight isn't pushing. The snow gets blown into a drift at the side of the house, that's all." "I don't care what you say, it's horrible. As if the snow was trying to get in." She sounded close to tears. "Let's see if the old tramp's woken up yet," Will said. It was time to stop Mary before she came too near the truth. How many other people in the country were being made as frightened as this by the snow? He thought fiercely of the dark, and longed to know what to do. The walker had slept through the previous day, hardly stirring except for occasional, meaningless mutterings, and once or twice a small hoarse shout. Will and Mary went up to his room now, carrying a tray with cereal and toast and milk and marmalade. "Good morning," Will said loudly and brightly as they went in. "Would you like some breakfast?" The walker opened a slit of an eye and peered at them through his shaggy gray hair, longer and wilder than ever now that it was clean. Will held out the tray toward him. "Fa!" the walker croaked. It was a noise like spitting. Mary said, "Well, do you want something else instead, then?" said Will. "Or are you just not hungry?" "Honey," the walker said. "Honey?" "Honey and bread." "Honey and bread. Honey and—" "All right," Will said. They took the tray away. "He doesn't even say please," said Mary. "He's a nasty old man. I'm not going near him any more." "Suit yourself," Will said. Left alone, he found the tail end of a jar of honey at the back of the larder, rather crystalline round the edges, and spread it lavishly on 3 hunks of bread. He took this with a glass of milk up to the walker, who sat greedily up in bed and wolfed the lot. When eating, he was not a pretty sight. "Good," he said. He tried to wipe some honey off his beard and licked the back of his hand, peeping at Will. "Still snowing? Still coming down, is it?" "What were you doing out in the snow?" "Nothing," the walker said sullenly. "Don't remember." His eyes narrowed craftily as he gestured at his forehead and said in a plaintive whine, "Hit my head." "Do you remember where we found you?" "No." "Do you remember who I am?" Very promptly he shook his head. "No." Will said softly again, this time in the old speech. "Do you remember who I am?" The walker's shaggy face was expressionless. Will began to think that perhaps he really had lost his memory. He leaned over the bed to pick up the tray with the empty plate and glass, and suddenly the walker let out a shrill scream and flinched away from him, cowering down at the far side of the bed. "No!" he screeched. "No! Get away! Take them away!" Eyes wide and terrified, he was staring at Will in loathing. For a moment, Will was baffled. Then he realized that his sweater had lifted as he reached out his arm, and the walker had seen the 4 signs on the belt. "Take them away!" the old man howled. "They burn! Get them out!" So much for lost memory, Will thought. He heard concerned feet running up the stairs and went out of the room. Why should the walker be terrified by the great signs when he had carried one of them himself for so long? His parents were grave. The news on the radio grew worse and worse as the cold gripped the country, and one restriction followed another. In all records of temperature, Britain had never been so cold. Rivers that had never frozen before stood as solid ice, and every port in the entire coast was iced in. People could do little more than wait for the snow to stop, but still the snow fell. They led a restless, enclosed life. "Like cavemen in winter," said Mr. Stanton. and went to bed early to save fires and fuel. New Year's Day came and went, and was scarcely noticed. The walker lay in bed fidgeting and muttering and refused to eat anything but bread and milk, which by now was tinned milk watered down. Mrs. Stanton said kindly that he was regaining his strength, poor old man. Will kept away. He was growing increasingly desperate as the cold tightened and the snow floated down and down. He felt that if he did not get out of the house soon, he would find the dark had boxed him up forever. His mother gave him an escape in the end. She ran out of flour, sugar, and tinned milk. I know nobody's supposed to leave the house except in a dire emergency, she said anxiously. But really, this counts as one. We do need things to eat. It took the boys 2 hours to shovel away through the snow in their own garden to the road, where a kind of roofless tunnel the width of one snowplow had been kept clear. Mr. Stanton had announced that only he and Robin would go to the village, but throughout the 2 hours, Will, panting and digging, begged to be allowed to go too, and by the end his father's resistance was so much lowered that he agreed. They wore scarves over their ears, heavy gloves, and 3 sweaters each under their coats. They took a torch. It was mid-morning, but the snow was coming down as restlessly as ever, and nobody knew when they might get home. From the steep-sided cutting in one road of the village, tiny uneven paths had been trodden and shoveled by the few shops and most of the central houses. They could see from the footprints that someone had brought horses out from Dawson's farm to help carve a way to the cottages of people like Miss Bell and Mrs. Horniman, who could never have managed it for themselves. In the village store, Mrs. Pettigrew's tiny dog was curled up in a twitching gray heap in one corner, looking limper and unhappier than ever. Mrs. Pettigrew's fat son Fred, who helped run the store, had sprained his wrist by falling in the snow and had one arm in a sling, and Mrs. Pettigrew was in a state. She twittered and dithered with nervousness. She dropped things. She hunted in quite the wrong places for sugar and flour and found neither of them, and in the end she sat down suddenly in a chair like a puppet dropped from its strings and burst into tears. "Oh!" she sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Staunton. It's this terrible snow. I'm so frightened. I don't know. I have these dreams that were cut off and nobody knows where we are." "We're already cut off," said her son lugubriously. "Not a car's been through the village for a week. No supplies, and everyone running out. There's no butter, and not even any tinned milk, and the flour won't last long. There's only 5 bags after this one." "And nobody with any fuel," Mrs. Pettigrew sniffed. "And the little Randall baby, sick with a fever, and poor Mrs. Randall without a piece of coal. And goodness knows how many more." The shop bell twanged as the door opened, and in the automatic village habit, everybody turned to see who had come in. A very tall man in a voluminous black overcoat, almost a cloak, was taking off his broad-brimmed hat to show a mop of white hair, deep-shadowed eyes looking down at them over a fierce hook nose. "Good afternoon," said Merriman. "Hello," said Will, beaming, his world suddenly bright. "Afternoon," said Mrs. Pettigrew. She blew her nose hard. She said, muffled by a handkerchief, "Mr. Staunton, do you know Mr. Lyon? He's at the manor." "How do you do?" said Will's father. "Butler to Miss Graythorne," Merriman said, inclining his head respectfully, "until Mr. Bates comes back from holiday. That is to say, when the snow stops. At present, of course, I can't get out, and Bates can't get in." "It'll never stop," Mrs. Pettigrew wailed, and she burst into tears again. Oh, Mum," said Fred in disgust. "I have some news for you, Mrs. Pettigrew," said Merriman in loud, soothing tones. "We have heard an announcement over the local radio. Our telephone being dead, of course, like yours, there's to be a fuel and food drop in the manor grounds, as the place most easily visible from the air in this snow, and Miss Graythorne is asking if everyone in the village would not like to move into the manor for the emergency. It will be crowded, of course, but warm and comforting. Perhaps, and Dr. Armstrong will be there. He's already on his way, I believe." "That's ambitious," Mr. Stanton said reflectively. "Almost feudal, you might say." Merriman's eyes narrowed slightly. "But with no such intention." "Oh, no, I do see that now." Mrs. Pettigrew's tears ceased. "What a lovely idea, Mr. Lyon. Oh, dear, it would be such a relief to be with other people, especially at night." I'm of the people, said Fred. Yes, dear, but... Fred said stoutly, I'll go get some blankets and pack some stuff from the shop. That would be wise, Merriman said. The radio says the storm will grow very much worse this evening, so the sooner everyone can gather, the better. Would you like some help with telling people? Robin began, pulling up his collar again. Excellent. That would be excellent. We'll all help, said Mr. Stanton. Will had turned to look out the window. At the moment of the storm, but the snow floating down out of the solid gray sky seemed much as before. The windows were so misted that it was difficult to see out of them at all. But he caught a glimpse now of something moving outside. There was someone out there on the snow road carved through Huntercombe Lane. He saw clearly only for a second as the figure passed the end of the Pettigrew's path. But a second was all he needed to recognize the man sitting erect on the great black horse. The rider has passed, he said quickly and clearly in the old speech. Merriman's head jerked round, but he collected himself and ostentatiously swept his hat onto his head. I shall be very grateful to have assistance. What did you say, Will? Robin, distracted, was staring at his brother. Oh, nothing. Will went to the door, making a great fuss over buttoning his coat. Just thought I saw someone. But you said something in a funny language. Of course I didn't. I just said, who's that out there? Only it wasn't anyone at all. Only it wasn't anyone anyway. Robin was still staring at him. You sounded just like that old tramp when he was babbling when we first put him to bed. But he was not given to wasting time on surmise. He shook his practical head and dropped the subject. Oh well. Merriman managed to walk closely behind Will as they were leaving the Pettigrews to scatter and warn the rest of the villagers. He said softly in the old speech, Get the walker to the manor if you can, quickly, or he will stop you from getting out yourself. But you may have a little trouble with your father's pride. By the time the Stantons reached home, after their struggling tour of the village, Will had almost forgotten what Merriman had said about his father. He was too busy working out how they could get the walker to the manor without actually having to carry him. He remembered only when he heard Mr. Stanton talking in the kitchen as they pulled off their coats and delivered their supplies. Good of the old girl having everyone in there. Of course they've got the space and the fires, and the old walls are so thick they keep the cold out better than anyone's. Much the best thing for the people from the cottages. Poor Miss Bell wouldn't have lasted long. Still, of course we're all right here, self-contained, no point in adding to the manorial load. Oh, Dad, said Will impulsively, don't you think we ought to go too? I don't think so, said his father, with the lazy assurance that Will should have known was harder to break than any fervor. But Mr. Lyon said it would be much more dangerous later on because of the storm getting worse. I think I can make my own judgment of the weather, Will, without getting help from Miss Graythorne's butler, said Mr. Stanton amiably. Oh, wow, said Max with cheerful rudeness. You rotten old snob, hark at you. Come on, that's not what I meant. His father threw a wet muffler at him. Inverted snobbery, more like. I simply don't see any reason for our trooping off to partake of the bounty of the lady of the manor. We're perfectly all right here. Quite right, said Mrs. Stanton briskly. Now, out of the kitchen, all of you. I want to make some bread. The only hope, Will decided, was the walker himself.